So it's great to be here. This is the first lecture I've given in 15 years. So I'm a little rusty and a little nervous. But you know, I have to hand it to Neil with his persistence to get me out here. You know, I'm working on a new book, so I wanted to run the ideas past an intelligent and sympathetic audience. So I thought this would be a perfect group. And you know, it's a bit of a leap from what people have been talking about today in terms of the clinical work. I did the clinical research back in the 90s, and in terms of the okay, you can hear me. Yeah, so in the spirit molecule, I more talked about the molecule than the spirit. And in the book I'm working on now, I want to be talking more about the spirit than the molecule. So it isn't really clinically based or pharmacologically based. It's more conjectural, more some spiritual musings about establishing an alternative model for some of the spiritual aspects of the psychedelic experience. So in terms of an overview, I thought I'd review the DMT research that we did at the University of New Mexico, then walk through the process of deciding to study ancient Hebrew phenomenon of prophecy as an alternative model of both understanding and integrating and applying the psychedelic experience, especially the more unusual spiritual elements of the psychedelic experience. I'll give a little background into scripture and this concept of prophecy. I'll talk about the prophetic message, which is the content or the information in the prophetic state, and then we'll suggest some implications of the model. Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah, okay, good. Okay, so first I'd like to extend my appreciation to all of those people at UNM that made this research possible. It was the first such study in the US in quite a long time, so it took a lot of organizing and getting people to help out each other. The people at the University of New Mexico were great. I received the majority of my funding from the National Institutes of Health, especially from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. FDA, DEA. The first grant I got was from the Scottish Rite Foundation. Okay, there we go. So Dave Nichols at Purdue University made the DMT, and of course all of the volunteers, their families and friends. Okay, so there's a couple of take-home messages and a couple of definitions. Let's start with the definition. So most people think of prophecy as predicting the future, but I'm going to be defining it more generally as the paradigmatic spiritual experience as described in the Hebrew Bible, or more the Old Testament. And I'll also, and in that context, then I'll be describing it, or I'll be defining it as the perception of spiritual or invisible worlds, as opposed to predicting the future. You know, sometimes predicting the future occurs within a prophetic state, but it isn't necessary for the definition. So with respect to some of the more controversial conclusions that I've been kind of mulling over, those are two in nature. One of which is that the core of the prophetic experience as described in the Bible is a psychedelic state. And the other is that the full flowering, so the full flowering of the psychedelic experience for the Western mind is prophecy. So in terms of my interest in this field, as an undergraduate, I became fascinated with the relationship. I started to think about the relationship between spiritual states, which came about through the ingestion of psychedelic drugs, and the descriptions of spiritual states which came about through other means, such as meditation, some near-death states, those kinds of experiences. So it seemed to me that there must be some common biological denominator either a particular part of the brain that was being activated and or it's some kind of or else some kind of psychoactive compound. I started off with an interest in the pineal gland because of its being the focus of attention of a number of esoteric physiological systems. All of the precursors and enzymes required to make psychedelic tryptamines occur in the pineal. But despite that, we still don't really have any evidence that the pineal gland makes DMT. And we still don't really know even if DMT levels increase during dreams or near-death states. I speak about a lot of circumstantial evidence in the DMT book, but we still don't have that data. But I was still interested in, so this was the early 1980s, and we didn't really know that much about melatonin. So I spent about 3 years working on a melatonin study. This was the first paper that came out. And so basically, we determined that melatonin was not psychedelic. And so I switched focus. I thought, if the pineal gland isn't involved, or if specifically melatonin isn't involved, then let's just go straight to the heart of the matter and study DMT. So let's see, DMT it's a chemical cousin of serotonin. So it's also closely related to melatonin. It is made in the body, in other words, it's endogenous. And the location of most of the DMT synthesis out there is made in the lungs, also in the red blood cells. It's quite common in the plant kingdom, as we all know, and it's the visionary ingredient in ayahuasca. So it took 2 years to get approval to get this study up and running. There were safety concerns, and I had anticipated those. A few years before, I had reviewed all of the adverse effect literature on psychedelics and published a review paper, and established that if you give psychedelics to carefully screened people in a carefully supervised circumstance, and you follow them up appropriately, then the incidence of the incidence of any kind of adverse effect would be quite low. Also, there is a bureaucratic jungle that I had to kind of hack my way through with administrative and a paperwork machete. And so this is a description of the process about how we got approval. I like to joke about this paper as the "what if I'm hit by a bus" paper, before anybody else can get any kind of research off the ground. So I was thinking it was important, to describe sort of step by step the FDA process, the DEA process, the local pharmacy process, all those things. So we approached the study from a psychopharmacological model, and more specifically, it was a dose-response model. So we gave small doses, medium doses, and large doses to a group of experienced hallucinogen users who were otherwise healthy, or especially healthy, as it were. So we gave quite a few doses to about 60 volunteers, around 400 doses total, spread out over the space of about 5 years. The endpoints that we were interested in looking at were serotonin related, all kinds of biological effects. In terms of the subjective effects, so we gathered those with a clinical interview, just speaking to the volunteers after they came down. And also I developed a paper and pencil rating scale, which was based on Buddhist psychological principles. So that is a paper that I wrote as a medical student, actually. Came out in 1980. It's interesting, the typo, medication as opposed to meditation, but this was 1980, so even meditation was, wasn't that much on the radar, within the context of psychiatry. So in terms of how we supervised the sessions, it was kind of a combination of a psychoanalytic approach and a Zen Buddhist, just quietly sitting approach. So the bottom line was that we just, sat quietly and were quite attentive to everything that was going on in the volunteer and in the room. So this is an article that came out in the journal Tricycle a few years back, which discussed the relationship between Buddhism and psychedelics, and it, specifically, focused on the interaction of, supervising sessions. So we got quite a few biological results, quite a few subjective, data results. All of the serotonin-related endpoints that we were anticipating would increased. This is the first paper describing all the endocrine and autonomic responses to graded doses of DMT. This came out in 1994, even though we finished the study at the end of 1991. And these are the psychological results. And also an interesting study that we did is to give people a number of doses of DMT closely spaced over the course of a morning. We gave a fairly substantial dose every half hour 4 times to determine if we could develop tolerance to the psychological effects, and there wasn't any tolerance to the psychological response anyway, dose after dose. Okay, so the state of mind that people entered into on the high dose of DMT, well, it's hard to describe, but a lot of people have tried describing it. It kind of starts off with a separation of mind and body, and then the consciousness of that person, it beholds an environment composed of light, in which they frequently interacted with clearly seen, sentient, often overwhelmingly powerful beings. One of the very common descriptions was that the experience was more real than real. It was also strangely familiar after the initial shock was over, an interesting, kind of quality to the effect. Classical near-death and the Buddhist enlightenment sort of experiences, which I expected would be relatively common, were actually quite rare. Just perhaps 2 people or 3 at the most. And so it was hard to get a grip on these stories, especially because they were counter to my expectations. I was expecting a unitive, kind of mystical, kind of white light experience. Or going through the tunnel, seeing ancestors, and then ending up, merging with some kind of Godhead figure. But instead, it was quite interactive, dynamic. The ego was maintained. Observational powers were maintained. So I went back to the drawing board after the study wrapped up in 1995. So there's a couple of approaches to this is your brain on drugs model of DMT. So one of them is what I guess would be called the neurotheology model, which is gaining some traction, and so that proposes that the brain generates these phenomena. The other might be what you could call a kind of theoneurology approach, more bottom down. I mean more top up. I mean more top down. In other words. As a result of the brain changes that occur with DMT, the receiving characteristics of the brain change, and it's now able to perceive things that are external but are invisible, most of the time. And you can think about, where that could reside: dark matter, parallel universes, multiverses, those kinds of things. So, one of the advantages of the top-down model is it could be possible one day to photograph people's DMT experiences if they're occurring out there. Some combination of brain scan technology and contemporary quantum physics kinds of machines, which would be a very interesting time when that happens. In either case, the scientific models focus primarily on the mechanisms of action, as opposed to understanding the experience as personal or cultural meanings and their applicability and integration. The other models, which describe the nature of invisible worlds, are the spiritual models. And also the spiritual models address more directly the meaning and the integration of these experiences. Are you guys with me so far, pretty much? Yeah, okay, good. Might sound simple. Yeah, it's taken me a long time to get this wrapped down, I'll tell you. It's it's a stretch, to extend myself beyond all of the brain chemistry and, pharmacology stuff. And I have no training in theology or philosophy or Bible studies or anything. I just, stopped being a Buddhist after my community gave me the boot when I was talking about DMT and Buddhist practice. So I thought, I'll just read the Bible. That's where I used to hang out. So after a while, the concept of Old Testament prophecy, began, to present itself, and it seemed like a rich, vein to start to mine. So in terms of candidate spiritual systems or religions, so they also are concerned with the nature of spiritual or the invisible worlds, and also how to apply that information within the individual and between people. So this is a quote, or kind of a paraphrase of Spinoza's distinction between superstition and a more adult, kind of true religion. One of them is the result of intellectual and meditative inquiry, and the other kind of mostly plays on people's hopes and fears. So Spinoza often described things in kind of a tongue-in-cheek manner, but I think his distinction between superstition, which a lot of people kind of hoist up as the straw man to battle against when it comes to the the war between science and religion. I don't think they're actually speaking about what Spinoza would refer to as a true religion. So the two contemporary spiritual models which have been used in understanding the psychedelic experience are the Buddhist model, and increasingly so over the last 10 years or so is the Latin American shamanic model. So Buddhism and the psychedelic drugs appeared almost at the same time on the Western scene in the late 50s, early 60s. And it's clearly relevant if you look at how many people entered the path of Buddhist meditation as a result of their psychedelic experiences. And that continues to be the case. In our study, though, the DMT response wasn't really typical of the Buddhist enlightenment experience as I had studied it and learned it within the Zen community. And it actually, could be the case that other compounds which are made endogenously are, more typically involved in those kinds of unitive experiences, such as 5-methoxy-DMT, which more typically, gives you an experience of the white light. Also, another shortcoming of the Buddhist model is their conviction that these experiences are the perceptions of the mind, as opposed to being perceptions of the external world or an external reality. which is freestanding and independent of the mind. And also another drawback is that most of us aren't Eastern, so it's a whole different, mindset and culture and psychology. So the other model, which is increasingly, popular in terms of understanding and applying the psychedelic state, is that of Latin American shamanism. Its strengths are on that it does account for the freestanding nature of the other worlds. It emphasizes spirits, though, rather than God most of the time, which, for many, Westerners could be a problem. Also, in the case of Buddhism as well, we don't really, come from that culture. And also, there's quite a few ethical and, moral shortcomings within shamanism, which everybody knows about. Or, contemporary shamanism, anyway. I have a joke. Terrence used to talk about shamans, but I won't share it. It's a bit off color. Okay, well, no, I won't. Afterwards, I will. Or, I'm like, once I'm down on the floor. Okay, well, so as an alternative, I started looking into the Bible and, Judaism. So what is the Bible? It's 24 books in Hebrew. There's a small amount of Aramaic, but the vast majority has been written in Hebrew. It's composed of three main parts. The first part's the Torah, which contains it contains the books of Exodus and of Genesis, Leviticus, those books. And the next section is called the prophets, which contains the books of Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah. And also, so the final section is called the writings, and it contains the Psalms and the wisdom literature such as Job and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. So the compilation of the Bible was finalized in around the 2nd century CE. So an extremely curious element of the Bible is that the Hebrew isn't punctuated and it isn't vowelized either. So that clearly opens the interpretation of the text to a huge amount of variability. So the punctuation and the vowels weren't added until the 10th century. So the contents of the Bible, obviously, is a huge book, and and its influence extends everywhere. Some of the more salient concepts which it describes are the nature and the activities of God. It also has a specific version of creation, and also it contains a huge amount of what is often called the law. But I think it is more accurate to define that as ethical and moral instructions or charges. In other words, a manifestation of the content of the psychedelic or the prophetic experience as being applied and integrated within a everyday kind of life experience. In other words, it's the manifestation of the content of the prophetic state into a kind of practical form. So there are certain certain advantages to looking at the Bible as a spiritual / psychedelic text. It describes a highly dynamic interactional relationship between humans and external spiritual forces. And so that was quite consistent with the reports of our DMT volunteers. It's got an ethical framework built in. It's tremendously popular. It serves as the original sacred text for 1/2 of the world's population, the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews. And its concepts and its vocabulary, its concept of God, its concept of law, of wisdom, of interpersonal relationships. All of those completely are infused into our culture and our minds and our literature and our science. And it has tremendous power. I mean, look at this building. I mean, this building would not exist if it weren't for the Hebrew Bible. So, one of the, complaints about the Bible is that it's been misused and terrible people have done terrible things with it. But on the other hand, our ignorance of it permits those, people who have less than scrupulous interpretations and applications of that power, to kind of interpret it for us or, for the larger community. So there are a number of resistances to looking at the study of the Bible as a spiritual or psychedelic text. One of those is that familiarity breeds contempt. But the vast majority of us, have not, become especially, familiar with the Bible. Like how many of you have actually, looked at the Bible in the last 5 or 10 years? So about 10 people. As compared to reading Tricycle or Shaman's Drum or Enlightenment or those things. So that's, it's under our nose, but on the other hand, it just seems completely foreign. Some people think it's an evil book because of how it's been used, but, other people can use it, people who've got a psychedelic mindset. A extremely common complaint is it makes no sense. And I have to admit, when I first opened it up, it just made no sense. Or even as an adult opening it up, again, it made no sense. But there are a small number of medieval Hebrew Jewish commentators on the Bible. There's just a handful, and all of their commentaries have been translated into English. And I'll tell you, if you can start to read those commentaries, it'll explain what these confusing and contradictory ideas and stories actually mean, or at least can give you some tools to start to understand some of the complexities of what's contained in there. Also, another problem with the Bible is that it's right under our nose. It isn't exotic enough. But as we know, exotic religions become, non-exotic, soon enough. So one more stumbling block to the Bible is the concept of God. The G word. Somebody was, describing it, during intermission today. And that was a problem for me too. The second word in the Bible is God, and most people just say, "Well, I'm not interested." And I felt that way for a long time as well. But I was able to, kind of get a kind of toehold on the concept of God from the perspective of Zen Buddhism. In other words, I was able to understand the concept of God as the creator and sustainer of cause and effect, or of karma. So if I could at least at first kind of make myself comfortable with exploring the concept by straddling, the Buddhist world and the Jewish world, it allowed in, some entryway into that concept so I could start learning more. And ultimately you'll come to the point of, or I suppose one can come to the point of understanding God as the most subtle and abstract of all concepts, as opposed to the stupidest or most barbaric. So, and it's also the goal of all sciences too. I mean, if you think about it, biology, pharmacology, physics, math, ultimately what these people are interested in is, the God particle or the God moment or the God, the God gene or the God, part of the brain. So it's, I think unconsciously that's what everybody is, kind of searching for ultimately, especially with respect, to theoretical science. So there's two ways to know God. I'm going to be speaking about God, I'm sorry, but I've just got to. If you're going to be talking about Old Testament prophecy, you have to speak about God, so, bear with me. So there's two ways to know about God. If you consider, the medieval Jewish commentators, So one is through the study of, the natural world, science, and the other is through prophecy. Okay, so it's the Hebrew Bible's version of spiritual experience, and it consists of beholding invisible things. And if you define it in those kinds of terms, it extends beyond simply the classical prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah. It extends to anyone in the Bible who's experiencing the perception of invisible things. And in a prophetic state, one beholds and communicates with God and angels. You receive a message, and then you relate it to the community. So it occurs within a prophetic state of consciousness. It's extremely visual, extremely auditory. There's the spoken word, all kinds of visions, extremely psychedelic visions. If you read the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, it's totally florid psychedelic stuff. There's extremely powerful emotions: anxiety, fear, joy, strength, those kinds of things. There's physical symptoms of agitation, internal pressure, falling to the ground. But at the same time, and kind of like DMT, once the initial shock is over, it almost takes on the nature of ordinary discourse, conversations, question and ask, questions and answers, those kinds of things. So there's dissociation of the mind and body, there's flying through space. And it's also interactive and it's relational. Also, it's an extremely, common hallmark is the description of it being, more real than real. So there's no question at all in the mind of the person experiencing the state of prophecy that it is the perception of an external, ongoing, parallel level of reality. So in all of these ways, it comports, fairly well with the DMT effect. So there's the person of the prophet as well, his constitution or her constitution, their training, their behavior, in terms of living an ethical and a moral life, and finally, there could be the element of grace as well, but that's another discussion. So the Hebrew Bible is a prophetic text. That's one of the points I would like to make. It either records prophetic experience, and/or it's written, by people in a prophetic state. There's some interest about descriptions in the Bible of, psychedelic plants. But if you take into account the nature of naturally occurring, psychedelic compounds, which are made in the body, you can dispense, with having to look, for external agents, to put individuals into a psychedelic state. So one of the drawbacks, of the model, especially with respect to DMT, is the predominance of auditory, kinds of occurrences in the prophetic state. The spoken word is very important, and the spoken word, even though it occurs here and there with DMT, isn't that common. So it could be that DMT is only one of many naturally occurring, naturally produced compounds in the body responsible for that state. There could be other compounds which have got a more predominant auditory effect. Okay, so what's the content of the prophetic message? This is obviously a huge question. Let's see. So people have these experiences with drugs in the contemporary setting, but it's extremely difficult to come back with a vocabulary and concepts which are applicable and which can be integrated into one's everyday life. So one of the advantages of considering the Bible as a place to get some orientation for the psychedelic experience is, to look at, their description of the content of the prophetic state. Okay. So the golden rule is, more or less the bottom line of the prophetic message. In other words, it is to love your neighbor as yourself, for I am a God, or I am the Lord. That's in Leviticus. And, so there are quite a few possible permutations. In other words, for example, you should treat others as you would like to be treated. You should treat yourself as well as you treat others. You shouldn't treat yourself as you wouldn't want others to treat you. You shouldn't treat others as you wouldn't want to be treated. So if you, kind of begin with that as, the core of the prophetic message, then everything else kind of extends out from that. The Ten Commandments, even such, everyday, prosaic, kinds of laws in the Bible, like if you dig a pit and your neighbor falls into it, it's your fault and you have to pay for his medical care. All that stuff, ultimately, kind of hinges on the golden rule. And, the message is, comes from God, who is described as an ethical and a moral thing. So the ethical and the moral content is kind of, built in to the source of the prophetic message. So the ultimate outcome of the application of the prophetic message is world peace. It isn't actually the equanimity of the individual. So it's a completely reverse, kind of approach as compared, to the Buddhist one, let's say, where one's individual enlightenment comes first, and then after that, world peace follows. So there are, some interesting novel insights that are contained in the Bible as well. For example, in terms of science, the whole concept of creation from nothing. Also, they have a very interesting view of history as, fulfilled prophecy. They've got concepts like the end of days, the Messiah, and resurrection. Also, there's some interesting, perspectives on human nature, such as Ecclesiastes and Job and Proverbs. So also, there's the concept of the false prophet, who they are and how to discern between true and false prophecy in ourselves and in other people. So it's interesting, to consider the, the biological underpinnings of, the information as well, the content of the prophetic message. In other words, if the prophetic experience is latent within the mind-brain complex, then so perhaps is the prophetic message. So a couple of implications are, so these kind of harken back, to some of the original take-home messages. If the core of the prophetic experience is, psychedelic in nature, then those who study the Hebrew Bible and are interested in entering the state of mind out of which the text emerged, it would be worth considering the judicious use of psychedelics. And the other implication of another one of the overview, points that I made. In other words, that the full flowering of the psychedelic experience of the Western mind as prophecy is that, for contemporary psychedelicists who lack a cogent vocabulary or conceptual or ethical framework by which to understand and apply the psychedelic experience, it's worth considering the Hebrew Bible as a spiritual text. Okay, so that's mostly what I wanted to try and get across today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You drew a distinction from your results of your DMT studies. You reported that DMT rarely consummated in unitive mystical experience.
Right.
Do you draw a distinction between prophecy and mysticism? And do you see the Hebrew Bible as a mystical document as well as a prophetic document?
Yeah. Well, those are both good questions. Yeah, and I spent some time discussing them in my current book. I'm going to be including an entire chapter on vocabulary and terminology in the book. But yeah, I do think so I do make a distinction between the prophetic experience and the mystical experience. The prophetic experience is interactive, it's dynamic. Ego integrity is maintained. There's questions, there's answers. And the mystical experience is, more the unitive, ego-dissolving, white light, kind of experience. And the question about do I, consider the Bible as a mystical text? Well, that's, kind of the Kabbalistic viewpoint. But I'm only going to be sticking, to the Bible. I'm, not going to be talking about Midrash or Talmud or Kabbalah in my book, because it's just a vast literature, and I just don't have the time or the skill or the energy, to tackle it. So I'll just be taking on the Bible, which is just 24 books, and the commentaries. So they also make a distinction, between the mystical state and the prophetic state. The mystical state is kind of a late development in Judaism, as opposed to the more kind of literal understanding of the text.
Your microphone. Thank you.
Hi, I've had the opportunity to ask two different shamans about their relationship to DMT, specifically when it's smoked. And one said, don't ever do it. It opens you up to adverse spirits that may or may not want to harm you. And the other one said, I love it, isn't it great? It's the best thing ever. And I'm just wondering where you stand on safety for the layperson.
Okay. I mean, are you asking if I think people should smoke DMT?
Yes.
And are you asking where to get some?
That's not the issue.
Yeah, those are the two most common questions I'm faced with. Where can I get some and should I do it? Or vice versa. Well, I don't encourage anybody, to take drugs, first of all. And, second of all, there's a lot of people interested in taking drugs, increasing number of people interested in taking DMT. So I think you just ought to educate yourself and prepare yourself, get your intent together, get yourself together as best as you can, if you're going to be using it. I think, somebody's saying it's the worst thing ever, don't do it. I mean, you have to kind of wonder about their motivations for giving, that kind of answer. Are they interested in you paying them a bunch of money to drink ayahuasca down in Peru, or, what exactly? So, in our study, people did fine. I screened them carefully. We supervised their, supervised their experiences very closely. Some people had, some rough spots in their experiences, but there was nobody harmed, and almost everybody really was glad to have participated. So within the context of our work, if you really mind your P's and Q's, the drug can be given safely.
Other questions? Hello? Question.
Thank you. You mentioned that there is an initial shock and that also there is an experience of peace later on. Do you also find that contact with God is associated with violence or uncontrolled rage sometimes?
I couldn't quite hear all that question. I'm sorry. Could you repeat it and maybe speak a little bit louder?
Is contact with God based on the Hebrew Bible associated with violence or uncontrolled rage on the part of the perceiver.
What do you mean in our volunteers? Or in general? On DMT or? Yeah, I'm not sure. I get your. Well, if you're asking, if the concept of God, as people are experiencing it, is as a violent, angry God, most of our DMT volunteers were not Jewish or Christian, or Muslim. They were pagans or Buddhists or nature, religious, kind of adherents. So the ones that had an experience which they described later on as God-like, it was very beatific, very nurturing, very loving. One of our volunteers encountered an extremely angry, kind of warrior, princess type. But that was actually the only person who encountered like a extremely, fears, inducing, kind of spiritual entity.
Okay, sir.
So, pardon my voice. I just remember that I'm losing it. So, you mentioned before that people's experiences are realer than real, and even further to say that it might be possible to document some of the experiences. I was wondering if you've ever tried to do an experiment where you've made two people experience DMT simultaneously, and if they've were able to interact within hyperspace, for lack of a better word.
Well, no, we never did that. No. Well, that's reported in ayahuasca sessions as kind of group hallucinations, but we never gave DMT to two people at the same time.
Sir.
Hi. I think part of what he was asking was what kind of psychedelics give the kind of auditory hallucinations that we associate with God in the Bible? Because let's say there's particular priorities in the morality described in the Bible that aren't necessarily what we associate with a lot of our psychedelic experiences. If not DMT, what kind of chemicals encourage auditory hallucinations with those kind of priorities, with hostility towards graven images and that kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, so one candidate, group of compounds are, the anticholinergic drugs, like scopolamine and, hyoscyamine and atropine, those kind of drugs. And I was speaking with, somebody this afternoon about ibogaine, which often gives you a spoken voice. It seems to be the case. And if those compounds exist in plants, some kind of congeners or, closely related compounds must exist in the body as well. We just haven't discovered them yet.
Miss. Just a second.
All right. There's a few universal human things, like the pursuit of happiness and this pursuit of prophetic states and spiritualities you were saying. Yeah, I'm getting excitable. Happiness can be considered intrinsic, and a lot of people consider things that make you happy to have intrinsic just value in their own. And also the thing about auditory things, I thought DMT affected part of your language, so wouldn't that make auditory things completely irrelevant? But serotonin's usually equivocated with happiness, and DMT is a very spiritual kind of thing. Do their similar structural components have to do with the intrinsic value of the two states?
I didn't catch the last part of that. Could you speak a little more slowly?
Yeah, the fact that serotonin and DMT are so similar to each other, would that contribute to the intrinsic value of both the happiness state and the state of spirituality, and the ability that you can't quite communicate them? That they have a weird value of their own, because they're cousins? Does that have something to do with the two different basic human things going on?
I might be having a seizure up here or something, but I just can't understand what you're asking. Could somebody translate or help me?
Could somebody else ask that question?
I'm sorry?
She wants to know the the chemical similarity of DMT and serotonin versus the effect similarity?
Okay. That's a good question. Well, yeah. Well, in terms of the pharmacology, DMT activates a number of different serotonin receptor subtypes. They're quite closely related from the point of view of functional pharmacology. If you give an individual, if you give an individual serotonin, it really it doesn't actually exert much in terms of acute effects on mood. Well, one of the interesting elements of our DMT results was that it increased concentrations of a hormone which is called vasopressin, and that's quite close to oxytocin, which are the two hormones which seem quite which are quite important for social bonding experiences. So it could be the case that some of the pro-social responses to ayahuasca and other psychedelic drugs could be related to the release of those hormones.
I think we have time for one last question, and I actually promised this gentleman over here, if you'll excuse me. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil.
Yeah. It seems to me that you're cherry picking out of the Old Testament. So I'm curious how you reconcile or square an alliance with prophecy or a prophetic experience with a God who is wrathful, vengeful, jealous, and advocates genocide.
Well, I'm sure I'm going to get asked that a lot. So here goes. Well, if you look at the Hebrew concept of God as acting through nature, too, there's earthquakes, and there's death, and there's fires, and there's infectious diseases, and there's wars. And if you look at those things as ordained or controlled or kind of regulated by God, you can then, kind of make the leap and say God is wrathful or vengeful. And also there's cause and effect. Certain things happen as a result of your actions. So, the Canaanites are the ones who were, ordered to be exterminated by, the Hebrews when they entered Canaan. And, God knows what the Canaanites were doing. They could have been, much worse, than the Nazis, or they could have been doing human sacrifice. Well, that's what I'm saying. Who knows? So I think we have to put that on the back burner and just.
Let's call it a night. Thank you. Yes.